Cool. All right. So go ahead and start asking questions for exam number 2 whenever you are ready. You can ask in the chat, you can ask in person. Asking in person is always preferable to me just because I'm kind of just talking to a screen this entire time.
Hey, how's it going? Can you just go over the general concerns for non-nutritive sweeteners and whether they have evidence in humans versus animals?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess first let's talk about which sweeteners are artificial and which ones are not, and then we can kind of transition. So the ones that are artificial are going to be the ones that were kind of created in the lab, like we had mentioned, or like they had mentioned in the video analysis to explained video. So we have sucralose, not to be confused with sucrose, but sucralose, saccharin, aspartame, acesulfame potassium, or ACE-K is another one. Those are all artificial. The natural ones are like lo huanguo or monk fruit extract. You have erythritol. All the tols are sugar alcohols. Those actually are slightly nutritive, so they actually have caloric value to them. Stevia, and then allulose was another one that was a little bit more recent. The main thing that I want you to get from the safety concerns is that a lot of people assume that artificial sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners are generally correlated to cancer. And that is, there is nothing that really ties them into cancer in a human population. Another thing is their impacts on weight. So you should know that the data demonstrates that there's a correlation between increased weight and artificial sweetener consumption, but that's a correlation. So you can't really make a lot of definitive statements or conclusions based on that. And then the other is increases in hunger. And so a lot of these areas of concern have been demonstrated in animals, but really nothing in humans. So that's the main thing that I kind of want you to get at that is there is room for concern in animals, but really nothing in humans.
Why is it that it's more for animals and not humans?
Possibly because animals have just different physiological mechanisms than humans. For instance, we know that in a lot of these animal studies too, what they were doing were they were giving them massive doses that they wouldn't be able to give humans. Giving them 10 times the daily amount. You can make weird things happen if you give anyone 10 times the amount of what they're supposed to consume on a daily basis, as well as them just having different metabolic parameters. So, for instance, when they gave saccharin to rodents, to rats, they found that they got bladder cancer, but their metabolism of those particular sweeteners is also different to ours. So it actually predisposed them. They were predisposed to getting cancer from interventions like that. Yeah, we can compare rats a lot of the time or mice to humans just because of the somewhat relatively high genetic similarities. Them being, living creatures is a lot better than doing it in a cell model, like using little cell cultures and whatnot, because they actually have all the physiological organ systems kind of working in tandem with one another. And we can modify rodents as well, which makes them a really good candidate for being able to do research on them. But in general, a lot of the reasons why we might also see that some of these effects are happening in rodents but not in humans is because of how well you can control what's going on in a rodent environment. So this is more on the side of hesitation towards non-nutritive sweeteners or artificial sweeteners, is that when you can really control a rodent's environment, you can really see what those effects are. When it comes to humans, you can't just shove a human in a room for 10 years and force them to only consume artificial sweeteners as their sweetener of choice or their sugary taste providing thing of choice. So I think a lot of the reasons are just because of the dosages as well as the differences in metabolism. But on the more hesitant side, perhaps, free living humans are a little bit harder to see some of these effects on, and to do research on humans for long periods of time is very, very difficult. Does that answer your question, Fernando?
Yes, sorry, I'm driving. It took me a minute to respond, but
No,
yes.
you're good. No worries. Ashley asks, what does denaturation do to a protein? So it unfolds the protein. A protein's function is based on its structure. So we have our our configurations of proteins, primary, secondary, tertiary, etc. But basically, what uh, denaturing a protein does is it unfolds the protein, and it basically makes it so it doesn't have its function anymore. So for instance, if we look at function of let's say like an egg white, right? Egg whites are, they're designed in a particular way that allows that liquid to kind of support the overall structure of the egg. When you cook the egg, when you denature the protein in the egg whites, that unfolding of the protein turns it from a liquid into a solid, right? So it's actually changing the physical structure. So you can kind of see that in real time, but at the same time, just denaturing a protein generally means that that protein can no longer do its job anymore. And denaturation can essentially happen through a lot of different means. It's not always heat. It could actually be through pH as well. So you can alkalize a food, or a more common one is to actually, quote unquote, cook a food with acid. So if you've ever had ceviche before, that's like lemon or some type of citrus or citric acid that's on top of some type of fish like tuna, and that cooks the fish or cooks the protein. It's denaturing the protein. Did I answer your question, Ashley?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Perfect. Of course. Okay, said, I know you said two short answer questions. One, are fruit sugars bad for you? Question mark. And what is the naturalistic fallacy? Yeah, so those are two of the questions. What are the other ones? I do have a question. Let me pull it up, actually. That way I have it. I do know off the top of my head that I have a question on the conditionally essential amino acids. So you should know what a conditionally essential amino acid is. Not essential, not non-essential, conditionally essential. I mean, you should know what all three are for the test in general, but for this specific short answer, I want you to be able to identify one specific conditionally essential amino acid, and there's the entire list in the PowerPoint slide, and you can revisit that portion of the lecture. So one specific conditionally essential amino acid, what context it is conditionally essential in, and then basically what is the function of that amino acid that kind of drives its essentialness, its requirement, right? So like an example would be arginine. So arginine in general becomes conditionally essential when, let's say, someone is under hypoxic stress, like relatively low oxygen levels for whatever they're doing. That could be because of activity, for instance, right? So they're running a lot, they're doing a lot of aerobic activity. And so when they consume that arginine, what it does is help supports the physiological system that allows them to produce more nitric oxide, allowing the blood vessels to expand more. So basically what that does is it helps support blood flow. And there's a whole list of different conditionally essential amino acids. So arginine is just an example there. There's also a question about pepsin and pepsinogen. So basically the way that proteins are digested. I guess I should just talk about it. So we have pepsin, which is actually helping with the digestion of proteins in the stomach. But first we form pepsinogen, which is like a precursor type of enzyme. The reason that it's important that we actually make pepsinogen first and don't immediately create pepsin is because if we immediately created pepsin in the stomach, the cells of our stomachs are also made of proteins. So that pepsin would actually digest the protein, almost like our stomach would be creating something that's eating itself. So what we do is we create pepsinogen that gets released into the stomach, and that pepsinogen reacts with the acid that's in our stomach, hydrochloric acid, and converts it into the active form of pepsin. So pepsinogen gets converted into pepsin with hydrochloric acid, and that basically allows that pepsin to now work on the proteins that are already in that stomach mixing with the hydrochloric acid. So that's those are, let's see, is there another one?
So that was pepsin reacts with hydrochloric acid, then becomes, or pepsinogen reacts with hydrochloric acid, then becomes pepsin, which helps with digestion of proteins.
Correct. Yes. And then
Mhm.
that's important because we wouldn't want to immediately create pepsin. Otherwise, we would start to digest our own stomach.
Is the pepsin what helps with the denaturization of proteins, like during digestion in the stomach?
That would more so be the acid. So the pepsin is going to be breaking up these long peptide chains into smaller chains or individual amino acids. The acid is what's going to be actually denaturing. So the enzymes aren't denaturing, they're breaking it down. What the acid and ultimately what heat can do in a cooking scenario, not inside of our body, but in, you know, if you were cooking egg whites, for instance, that's what's unfolding the protein. So it's almost like the unfolding allows that protein to be more susceptible to being chopped up by the enzymes. The unfolding is by the acids or heat in a cooking scenario.
Okay, so the denaturization only occurs through the protein or through like stomach acid, through the stuff, through
Yeah, acid,
the
heat.
pH change.
Right. The acid, heat, physical manipulation is another way to denature protein. So if you've ever like beaten egg whites before with like a whisk, that physical manipulation also starts to denature the proteins. Or if you've used like a meat tenderizer, the meat tenderizer starts to help break down some of those proteins as well. And it's not breaking them up into shorter chains, it's just unfolding the structure of that protein. Did that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. There is another question, and I know we talked about this at length, besides the two that Katie mentioned, on omega-3s specifically. So like what the best source of omega-3s is. And so to reiterate, if we actually look back at that chart of total omega-3 content, we see that plant sources like flax are really, really high in omega-3. The problem is that the source of that omega-3 is ALA, right? Alpha linolenic acid. And that ALA really doesn't do the job that we want it to do until it gets converted into EPA and DHA. That's really what we want to get, is EPA and DHA. And our bodies are absolutely horrible at converting ALA into EPA and DHA. Are just metabolically, when we consume plant sources of omega-3s, we're just not very good at converting it. So that's why we, even if there's a smaller total amount of omega-3 coming from a source like salmon or tuna, that fatty fish tends to be an overall better source because we're not consuming the plant versions, we're consuming the already converted EPA and DHA. So basically the fish consume things like phytoplankton, etc., the plant sources, the ALA sources, and converted it into EPA and DHA. Then we eat the fish, we get the already converted versions of EPA and DHA, which are what we ultimately wanted in the first place, because EPA is what mediates the anti-inflammatory actions, and DHA is what is largely responsible for a lot of the pro-eye and brain health functions that we kind of relate to it.
So pretty much plant sources don't typically contain EPA, they contain ALA, but animal protein such as salmon does contain already the EPA and the DHA, which is more beneficial.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
I mean, it really only becomes beneficial once it is EPA and DHA.
Okay.
So
Right.
we could consume just large amounts of plant sources, but the efficiency of being able to convert that is not great, which is why you get a lot more bang for your buck by consuming the already converted forms from an animal source. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. I know that's it's a pretty complex, I guess, concept relationship type of thing, but I do think it's important to kind of note that. So you can consume enough plant proteins to eventually get the EPA and DHA you need. It's just not the most efficient way of doing that because of our metabolic rate of conversion is just atrocious.
And then you said that EPA is anti-inflammatory and the DHA is the eye and brain health, right?
Correct. Yeah, those are the
Thank you.
main functions. Yep. Selema asks, which NNS are artificial and which are naturally occurring? Yeah, so the artificial ones are sucralose, acesulfame potassium, aspartame, saccharin, and then the naturally occurring ones would be ones like allulose and stevia and monk fruit extract and all of the talls, which I wouldn't really necessarily put under the whole category of non-nutritive sweeteners. They do have some calories in them, but we do put them under like this kind of like an alternative sweetener kind of category. So those are like your erythritol, your maltitol, and basically if it ends with a tol, it's sugar alcohol, which is still nutritive. So I wouldn't expect you to kind of see that when I'm asking a question about non-nutritive sweeteners. Hopefully that answered the question.
Are you going to post this Zoom meeting?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep. Ashley asked, trans fat structural differences and health consequences. Yeah, so the main thing I need you to know about trans fat is that it has a positive relationship with heart disease. And when I say that, I mean that more consumption means more incidence of heart disease happening. The structural differences is essentially if we look at a fatty acid chain, we can find double bonds. And depending on where the hydrogens are located relative to that double bond will indicate whether it's a trans fat or not. So typically it's unsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats that have one or more double bonds. So you'd have to look for a double bond to look to see if it is a trans fat. So if there's a double bond and then the hydrogens are on the same side of the double bond, so there's two hydrogens on either side and no hydrogens on the other side, then that would be a cis fat, CIS fat. If there's one on one side and one on the other, right? So they're opposite to one another, then that would be a trans fatty acid. And that cis configuration with most unsaturated fats, what it kind of does is it creates like a kink in the structure that makes it harder to pack together. And so that's why most unsaturated fats tend to be liquids at room temperature because of that kind of kink that doesn't allow it to really compact together. And then the reason that trans fats were beneficial is because essentially by having a hydrogen on either side, it unkinks that structure and makes it much more structurally similar to a saturated fatty acid, which is typically solid at room temperature. So essentially the objective of creating trans fats was to make liquid fats into solid fats, conferring all of those like flavor and texture characteristics that people really like from solid fats like butter, etc.
Can you go over the fat functions?
Yeah. Oh, off the top of my head, let's see. Insulation, so from heat or from cold, mostly from cold. Protection, so protection for your organs. Energy is probably the biggest one, just because it's our pretty much indefinite storage of energy, because we can only store so much carbohydrate as glycogen. We can pretty much indefinitely store fat. We have hormones. So like cholesterol is a type of fat, it's a sterol. It makes up things like cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Structure as well. So cholesterol helps make up cells. It helps make up those hormones. Like I mentioned before, they're integral in the structure. Plants have sterols as well, which serve a similar function. Those are plant sterols specifically. Let's see what else. There's an entire slide in the fat chapter that just lays out all the functions. I'm pretty sure that I just covered most of them, right? Phospholipids is another one right there. So that's also structure. that also mediates the way that things can interact with the cell. So the phospholipid bilayer allows particular things to interact with the cell, and other things selectively have to bind to receptors on the outside instead of being able to pass across. So those are general functions. I'm pretty sure that covered all of them, but I would just make sure you go and check that portion. There's literally, I think, a list on really early in the fat chapter slides.
Thank you.
Of course. Nadia asked, what are the fat functions? Triglycerides, free fatty acids, cholesterol. Oh, okay. So I just mentioned that one already. That's good. You should know the difference between a tag of free fatty acid. A tag stands for triglyceride. What it actually stands for is triacylglycerol, but it usually just gets abbreviated to tag. Sometimes you'll see TG. If you're like in a lab or in a blood testing scenario, you might see TG, alternatively known as tag. And basically what a triglyceride is just a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached to it. So there's a triglyceride is 3 free fatty acids, free fatty acid, free fatty acid, free fatty acid. And breaking those apart is called lipolysis, right? And then cutting up those individual free fatty acid chains at every second carbon, that's called beta oxidation. The other fats are sterols, phospholipids. I don't think I'm missing anything there. I think we go into lipoproteins as well. So you're going to want to focus on the differences between the different lipoproteins: chylomicron, VLDL, LDL, HDL. Which, if anyone wants me to focus on that, just let me know.
Can you go over that?
Sure, absolutely.
Awesome.
Thanks for asking. So chylomicrons and VLDLs, structurally, what they are mostly carrying are triglycerides. The difference is where those triglycerides are coming from. So a chylomicron is carrying triglycerides that come from the diet, so the triglycerides that a person is consuming. Basically, that chylomicron is a vehicle for those triglycerides to be transported in, along with cholesterol and fat-soluble vitamins, out into the systemic.
It's good. I think I should have mixed it though, because I got the coffee all at top first, but it's good. It does taste like Fruity Pebbles.
Yeah.
Nice. It does sound good.
Oh, sorry, guys.
You're good. And then VLDL is also carrying mostly triglycerides, but those fatty acids and cholesterol are actually synthesized in the liver itself. So they're what we call endogenously synthesized. So those are going to be transported, and as that VLDL is dropping off triglycerides to the cells that need it, what happens is the VLDL, which stands for very low density lipoprotein, starts to shrink. It goes from very low to low density because those fats, those triglycerides are pretty fluffy. They're pretty they don't occupy a whole lot of space. And so it transitions from a VLDL into an LDL, and because it was dropping off its triglycerides, it now is mostly carrying cholesterol. And so the reason that we consider LDL to be our quote unquote bad cholesterol is because when we have a lot of LDL in circulation, kind of like traffic, what can happen is when there's a cellular injury in the vascular tissue. So if there's like a nick in your artery, for instance, that LDL can get lodged in that injury, and then it dumps out its cholesterol payload into the soft tissue, which the body is not a super big fan of, and so it initiates an immune response that creates the plaques that eventually form, continue to build and rupture, which can cause blockages to very particular blood vessels, like the ones that lead to the brain, like the cerebral arteries, as well as the coronary arteries that lead to the heart, which can cause a stroke and a heart attack in those instances. So HDL is also primarily carrying cholesterol. The opposite effect, though, is, or I should say that HDL has an opposite effect to LDL. So LDL is carrying cholesterol from the liver out to the rest of the body. HDL is carrying it from the body back to the liver. So the terms for that, when we're talking about LDL, that's considered forward cholesterol transport. So from the liver out to the body. What HDL does is called reverse cholesterol transport. So it's carrying it from the body back to the liver. And we tend to think of HDL as protective because there's less of a chance of those plaques forming when there's less cholesterol, less LDL particles floating around in the bloodstream. Did that all make sense? If it didn't make sense, let me know what I can clarify. Otherwise, you can just listen to that over and over again. Going once, going twice. Okay. Samantha asked on the carbohydrates. I'm assuming it's chapter 7. Oh, 7 protein. Where does fat go after intestinal absorption but before reaching systemic circulation? Cool. Well, let's cover protein versus fat. So carbohydrate and protein, they both get absorbed into the intestinal cell, which is called the enterocyte, and then they exit into a very specialized vessel called the hepatic portal vein. You can just say portal vein. So the portal vein goes directly to the liver for further processing, and then that's when those nutrients can then go out into the systemic circulation. For fat, it's a little bit different. So fat requires that transporter, that chylomicron, once it's in the enterocyte. I guess I should start a little bit higher up just to reiterate the point that you always need some form of phospholipid to carry the fat. So when fat is emptied from the stomach into the small intestine, it can't mix, so it needs the phospholipids that come from bile. Those phospholipids encase smaller amounts of fat, so it takes the big glob of fat that's released from the stomach into the small intestine, and it packages it up into smaller bits. Those individual little molecules are called micelles, M-I-C-E-L-L-E. That allows fat to get transported to the enterocyte or the intestinal cell, where those broken down fats that have been acted on by your pancreatic lipases are going to then go into the enterocyte, reformed into triglycerides, and then repackaged into their chylomicron vehicle, which is also going to have those phospholipids encasing them. And after that happens, those phospholipids or those chylomicrons go into not the hepatic portal vein, but they go into the lymph, which is another function of the circulatory system, but it's its own physiological organ system. And so after it goes into the lymph, then it gets into systemic circulation. So we go intestine to the lymph and then out to the body, versus protein and carbohydrate were intestine, portal vein, liver, and then the rest of the body. You know if that answered your question. Thumbs up.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay. Salima asks, are there any other label to figure questions besides the amino acids? That's a great question. Let's take a look at these. No, that's the only label one. There is a matching. That's going to be covering our different saccharides. So monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. There is one that is, if you remember the practice that we did in class for being able to label fatty acids. So if I give you a fatty acid, you should be able to identify, which one is cis, if it's a polyunsaturated or it's an unsaturated fatty acid. You should be able to identify which one's saturated, which one's a monounsaturated versus a polyunsaturated. Remember, monounsaturated is only one double bond. Polyunsaturated is more than one. And then it's an omega-3 or an omega-6, depending on where that double bond is starting relative to the omega end. I'm not going to give you two ends. I'm not going to give you an omega end and a carboxylic acid end. I'm just going to give you one end. So make it as easy as possible. Alexa asks, can I explain the different carbon atom chain lengths in fatty acids? Yeah, sure. So like basically the difference is that we have long chain, medium chain, and short chain fatty acids. Most of the fatty acids that we're consuming are long chain fatty acids. So most of the triglycerides that we're consuming have, I can't even remember what the threshold is for what makes something a long chain versus a medium chain. But in general, things like our polyunsaturated fatty acids are all long chain fatty acids. Medium chain fatty acids are fairly uncommon. The only example that I can probably think of off the top of my head are things like coconut oil, which are primarily saturated fats, but they're medium chain fatty acids, which means that they actually get metabolized a little bit faster. Which is why some people say that coconut oil is better for energy, just because it actually just gets metabolized faster. And then short chain fatty acids, we don't talk a whole lot about, but we have talked about them before because short chain fatty acids are what's actually produced by the gut bacteria when they're metabolizing things like undigested carbohydrate or fiber. So remember, they create two things when they digest undigested carbohydrates or fiber. They make gas and they make short chain fatty acids. I think that answers that, because I'm not going to be asking you about very specific numbers like what is a 16 carbon long chain. That's, I'm not going to ask you about something like that. Of course. Let's see. Fernando asks, can I go over the pepsin and HCl thing again? Yeah, I can go over that again. No worries. I know that's a little, it probably, y'all would probably benefit from hearing it again. So basically, protein digestion starts in the stomach, and there's two things that really are doing that. Pepsin, which is an enzyme. Pepsin was actually discovered before that whole ACE naming scheme came about. So you know how most enzymes end with like lipase or amylase, they end in an ACE. So there were certain enzymes that were actually discovered before that naming convention kind of came up. So examples are like gastrin and pepsin, for example. So pepsin is mainly what's going to be chopping up larger protein chains into shorter peptide chains. And then we have hydrochloric acid, which is our main stomach acid that the chief cells of our stomach are actually producing. So the acid is denaturing the proteins or unfolding them. And then the pepsin is breaking the long proteins, the unfolded proteins, into shorter chains for us to eventually be able to get into the small intestine. And then we have other enzymes like chymotrypsin and things like that that are going to be breaking up those proteins even further before they can enter into the intestinal cell. So the main thing with pepsinogen is that our chief cells, I said they create pepsin, what they actually create is pepsinogen, which is an inactive form. So it's not active. That pepsinogen gets created basically by the cells that are in the wall of the stomach, and then they move towards the center as they're released, where they start mixing with things like hydrochloric acid. And that hydrochloric acid is actually going to convert or turn that pepsinogen into pepsin. So it activates the pepsinogen into pepsin. And the reason that's important is because if our stomach cells just made pepsin, they didn't make the inactive form first, there's basically nothing stopping the pepsin from just eating away or breaking down the proteins that make up the stomach in the first place. So we would do something called auto-digestion. We would auto-digest our own stomach, which you don't want to do, obviously. We don't want to burn through our stomach. We want to digest the food. So hopefully that paints the picture properly. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. I think that covered all the questions that I've seen in the chat. Give you some time to come up with more. Let me just go over the format real quick. So it's pretty much the exact same format. We have multiple choice that are worth 2 points. We have true and false that are worth 1. How many of these multiple choice do we have? About 25 multiple choice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 true or false. Once again, I would pay attention to what words are bolded because I try to give you hints in places. There's that one labeling for an amino acid. There's a matching that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different things for you to match. As is with last time, you need a Scantron with a pencil that will work for it. I had someone do a Scantron with a colored pencil one time and it doesn't register. So make sure that you have like a number 2 pencil or an equivalent to that. What else was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so your true false and your matching, not your match there, your true false and your multiple choice, those are put in under their respective numbers on the Scantron. Everything else, like the matching, the fill in the blank, those are done on the actual paper exam itself. I'm going to say this now, if you, whatever you put on the Scantron is the answer that you are selecting. If you put it on the Scantron, I was nice this last exam, but I'm going to make sure I'm saying this now. If it's listed on the Scantron, that's the answer I'm taking. If you circled something different on your exam, I'm not going to give you points for that. So if you
Not even half
right
a point.
answer, no, because then you basically get to pick 2 answers, right? So I mean, you know, I wasn't
True.
explicit about that in the first exam, but I'm going to be explicit about that now. So I throw you a bone when possible, but I'm not going to be as nice for this one. So you got 1, 2, you got 2 fill in the blanks with 2 blanks each. So each fill in the blank is worth 2 points for a total of 4 points. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 short answers, 5 short answers, and 2 extra credit. 2 extra credit questions. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure.
For soluble versus insoluble, it asked about the gel formations, gut transition times, and the health benefits. Could you explain that?
Sure. Let's go over the health benefits first. So the main thing with soluble fiber is that it can reduce cholesterol levels because it binds to cholesterol. It can reduce glucose levels because what it'll do is it'll actually kind of bind to glucose as well. In general, though, the way that soluble fiber works is it creates those gels. So it is soluble, so it mixes with water and it forms those larger masses. Transit time, how that works is that it generally slows down transit time because it's creating basically like a larger mass. Insoluble fiber tends to have benefits like for like preventing gut inflammation, like diverticulitis and things like that. And the main reason for that is it actually just kind of like insoluble fiber, because it doesn't mix, it just kind of like scrapes along the colon as it moves, and that actually like triggers water to get drawn in, and then it makes things move faster. So basically when there's a lot of water in your intestine, it makes things kind of flush out basically. So what that means is that insoluble fiber causes gut transit to move faster, so it reduces transit time, whereas soluble fiber increases transit time. The difference too is that soluble fiber makes those big gels. Insoluble fiber is insoluble, so it doesn't mix with water. It pretty much retains its shape the entire time. But a lot of the benefits of soluble fiber related to things like the binding to cholesterol, the reductions in things like blood glucose, for instance. And part of that too is that when it forms that gel in the stomach, it slows the rate at which glucose can empty from the stomach into the small intestine. So basically it dilutes whatever sugar you have. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Could you also go over the fiber recommendations?
Yeah, okay. Oh boy. 14 grams per 1,000 calories or 28 grams per 2,000 calories. So you should know that those are basically the same thing, right? So those are both recommendations. And then, oh gosh, off the top of my head, is it 32 and 25? I'm trying to remember. Does anyone have the slides out in front of them? Males and females, the AI for it. I want to say it's 32 and 25. I'm going to find it. It's
Someone
25
said yes, that it's 25 for females and
25
38 for
for
males.
females and 38 for males. 38. Yep, that's perfect. Thank you. Good. So those are the two recommendations that I want you to remember. 25 for females, 38 for males, and then the more general rule of thumb is that 28 grams per 2,000 calories, which is the same thing as 14 grams per 1,000 calories if you just do the math, or 42 grams per 3,000 calories. But I wouldn't trick you, like, I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, is it 32 grams or 38 grams for males, right? Like that's kind of tricky. I wouldn't do that. I mean, I will trick you every now and then just for fun, but I'm not that mean when it comes to numbers. I don't like tricking with numbers, you know. Nadia asked, can I go over the lipoproteins, what they're each mostly made up of their transport function? Sure, I can go over that again. That's fine. So we have chylomicrons, VLDLs. I'm just going to go over it a little faster since I've talked about it already. VLDL, LDL, and HDL. Main difference between chylomicrons and the rest of them is chylomicrons are dietary, right? So VLDL, LDL, and HDL are all transporting cholesterol and triglycerides that are made within the body endogenously. Chylomicrons are repackaged triglycerides that were consumed in the diet and distributing them throughout the rest of the body. Chylomicrons and VLDL are mostly carrying triglycerides. Okay. Specifically with VLDL, which is transporting triglycerides that are made in the body. It's also carrying cholesterol that's made in the body. As a VLDL transports around the circulation and it drops off triglycerides, what's going to happen is it's going to shrink. So it goes from a VLDL to an LDL because it goes from being very low density, which basically means it's big and fluffy, to less fluffy. It goes from very low density to low density. So as it drops off triglycerides, we end up becoming smaller, and now it has a higher proportion of cholesterol. That LDL is now carrying mostly cholesterol. HDL is also mostly carrying cholesterol. The difference is the directions which they're going. So if you remember, VLDL was transporting stuff from the liver out to the rest of the body. We call that forward cholesterol transport from the liver out to the body. HDL is reverse cholesterol transport from the body back to the liver. Is that?
Can I ask a question in regards to what you just said?
Sure.
I don't know if I heard this right, but you said VLDL transports and shrinks, and then you said LDL carries cholesterol, HDL carries cholesterol in a different direction.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So they're both mostly carrying cholesterol. That's their primary constituent. It's just the direction in which they're doing it. So LDL is considered quote unquote bad because what it's doing is it's keeping cholesterol in circulation, which increases the risk for those plaques to form. HDL is considered our good cholesterol because it's moving that cholesterol back to the liver, which removes it from that circulation. So it's almost like removing the risk for those plaques to form. And no worries, Nadia. I don't mind going over things again. I'm just going to go over them a little faster if it's the second time. So I think it's, there's a lot of information that's being said. So
did you go over what bile does for fat absorption?
Yeah, sure. So the main thing that bile is doing is that it has the phospholipids in it that allow big amounts of fat to get broken up. So you think of bile kind of like you would think of dish soap. If you try to wash a really, really greasy, fatty dish with just water, they're just not going to mix. But you add the dish soap to it, and now all of a sudden it becomes soluble in the water. And the reason for that is that inside of that dish soap, there are phospholipids. And basically what those phospholipids are doing is they're taking a big glob of fat and they're breaking it up into smaller little globs by encasing them with phospholipids. So what bile is doing, and the liver makes bile, the gallbladder stores bile. When we eat a fatty meal, that gallbladder releases some of those bile acids, which contain those phospholipids, and it takes the big glob of fat that is entering into the small intestine from the stomach, and it breaks it up into smaller little ones that we can now actually mix with the fluids in our small intestine. And it also gives those globs more surface area to interact with the intestinal cells, which have those enzymes that are going to also help break down some of those fats into their smaller chains and absorb them. So basically the function is, I don't even know if I said this, it emulsifies. It emulsifies the fats. There's no bile in the stomach. It's entering into the small intestine. It gets dumped into the small intestine. Yep.
This is the part in class where you're asking us like what cholesterol goes down, right? And then like the other one goes down.
Oh, you don't need to know that for your exam, but
Okay.
basically, like I was just trying to illustrate the point of why certain fats are considered good or bad. So like trans fat, what it does is it increases LDL cholesterol and it decreases HDL, which is, so basically what it does is it increases the bad cholesterol and decreases the good cholesterol. So that's not a good scenario. Saturated fat increases LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, but it also increases HDL, which is the good cholesterol. So it kind of is pretty neutral overall. Unsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats pretty much have a neutral effect. So they don't really affect HDL or LDL cholesterol. And then polyunsaturated fats like omega-6 and omega-3, they increase HDL and they decrease LDL. So they basically have a really positive effect, but it's kind of misleading to think that, because like in general, people would say, oh yeah, I just need to consume all, polyunsaturated fats. That's kind of misleading because we know that polyunsaturated fats also have other effects. Remember, so omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, relating to brain health and eye health. But you don't want too many theoretically, because you need inflammation for certain things. By the same card, we need the pro-inflammatory aspects of omega-6s, but too much can cause damage to tissues, too much clotting, things of that nature. So there's a lot of context. Like I said, you're not going to be quizzed on that. It's just a matter of I just kind of wanted to illustrate why certain fats tend to be seen as more good or more bad. Any last minute questions? We got a couple of minutes.
What makes amino acids unique versus carbohydrates and fats?
Structurally, it's the nitrogen. So carbohydrates and fats are made up of three elements: carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And then amino acids have all of those constituents, but what makes them unique is their amino group, which has a nitrogen in it. So that you can always tell which one is the amino group if you're labeling it, because it's going to have the N or the nitrogen in there. You should know.
Sorry, may you say the three elements again?
Sure. So the three elements that make up all of them: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But then amino acids have the fourth one. They're also made of nitrogen. Yeah.
Can you go over the naturalistic fallacy definition?
Sure. So the naturalistic fallacy is basically the idea that just because something is natural means that it's better for you, or that it confers an advantage over something that's artificially created. And I mean, there's classic examples that aren't food related that you could think of: buildings and glasses and cars and everything have, a lot of, like medicine, for instance, a lot of time is artificially created, and it's helped improve our lifespan, allowing us to live for a lot longer and stay healthier for a lot longer. But even from a food perspective, if we think about unnatural things that we do to food, we had this big issue with the idea of like processing being good or bad, and it's not. In general, what I'm trying to teach in this class is that there's no such thing as really good or bad. It's about considering the overwhelming context. So processing is basically doing anything to a food. Washing your food is good, right? And generally speaking, because you're getting rid of microbes. Cooking your food has different implications. Sometimes cooking your food makes the nutrients more available. Sometimes overcooking the food can lead to a reduction in nutrients. So What was I getting at with that? I was getting at the naturalistic fallacy. So, for instance, with the artificial sweeteners case, we have a lot of evidence, like so many hundreds, if not thousands, of studies cumulatively between artificial sweeteners like aspartame and sucralose. And there's this idea that they're not good for us because they're artificial, whereas the majority of that research basically says that there's no negative impact on our health for humans. Whereas if we look at something like stevia, for instance, there's way less research on it, but because it's natural, people assume that it's going to be better for us than something like aspartame or sucralose. So even if there's, in a hyperbolic scenario, which means, in a much more what does hyperbolic mean? Like a more drastic scenario and a more exaggerated scenario. If there was zero evidence on something, if it was natural, people would probably assume that it's better, even if there was something that had 1,000 studies on it and it demonstrated that it was safe. So that's the idea of the naturalistic fallacy.
Can you go over relative protein needs relationship with age?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and to clarify too, we'll probably just go until, if y'all still have questions, we'll go until 11:10, just because I took 10 minutes to make sure that everyone was in the room. So relative protein needs essentially increase with, I'm sorry, that was the opposite. It essentially decreases with increasing age. There you go. I had to like reorient my thoughts and think about the graph in my head. So basically what that means is that when you're a baby, you don't have a very large need for an absolute amount of protein, like the overall number, but relative to your weight, you need a lot, right? Because babies don't weigh very much. So even if the overall gram amount is pretty small, it is still a high relative amount, because even if a baby is consuming 20 grams, a baby doesn't weigh all that much. Whereas when you're an adult, you don't need as much protein relative to your weight, right? So the average adult consumes, probably like 50 or something grams of protein per day, but they're weighing, anywhere between 130 and 200 pounds. So relative to body weight, babies are consuming a lot more protein. The unfortunate thing about like y'all listening to the lecture online, I don't really get to talk about it as much. I can't remember if I talked about it in the Zoom lecture, but the relationship between protein and age actually does change over time. So that graph really only led up to, I think, like the 30s and beyond. But really, when you get older, like when you're in your 60s, 70s, and beyond, your protein needs actually go up as well. So it's actually an inverted U kind of shape, right? So your relative needs are high as a baby, and then as you reach your adult years, the relative needs decrease, and then when you become like a very much older individual, senior kind of level, then you are actually consuming more. But that is not on your exam. What I want you to know for the exam is that your relative needs decrease with age for protein. Is that confusing, or is that okay?
Do you want to just remind me about that on the day of the exam? I'm
Sure.
just kidding.
Absolutely. Just if you, I'm always open to like, hey, any last minute questions. If you mention that, I'll give you the answer to it right there.
Nice. Can you go over kwashiorkor?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so kwashiorkor and marasmus. Kwashiorkor is a protein deficiency, so it's a pure protein deficiency. And so what you see is that when someone purely lacks protein, you're going to get issues like edema in particular areas, because proteins help with fluid balance. So people with kwashiorkor are typically good with energy, good with all their other nutrients, but they lack protein. So it's an actual protein deficiency. And so they end up with edema in their ankles, edema in their stomachs, for instance. Whereas marasmus is an overall energy deficiency. Okay, so they tend to be a lot more traditionally looking like they're starved, for instance, right? Like very emaciated, very thin, very fragile, very weak. And that's not just protein. They are deficient in protein, but they're also deficient in just total energy in general and probably many other things at the same time. You're not expected to know how to spell those two. If I did ask you how to spell kwashiorkor, man, as long as you got something that looks kind of similar to it and kind of sounds like it, if I said it out loud, then that would be fine. But I'm not going to ask you that. That sounds like common sense, and I did make you try to spell resveratrol, but you know, if you tried, then I gave you points for it on the last exam. So try not to be a hypocrite. I'm going to say it now because no one's asked about it, but is fruit sugar good or bad for you? The main things that I'm looking for is that fruit sugar in general is not going to be bad for you because fruits have water and fiber in them, which help to kind of blunt the effects of that increase in blood glucose. It also kind of slows down the eating process because it makes you feel more full because of the extra water and fiber. So if you just said vitamins and minerals, then you would get some points, but not the whole thing. I'm looking specifically for water and fiber being some of the main components, because when you remove the water from a fruit, dried fruit is pretty easy to overconsume. When you remove the fiber from the fruit, then it's also a lot easier to consume, because then you have instances where, you know, you can, if you were to take 5 apples, you could turn that into a glass of apple juice and you could chug that thing down pretty fast. But eating 5 apples individually would take you much, much longer. That fiber slows it down considerably. Last minute questions. We got 2 minutes left.
How were most of NNS discovered?
Scientists tasted them. They had bad laboratory practices. They went on smoke breaks and worked with dangerous chemicals and decided to touch bread and eat it.
So, that's like how most of them were discovered. We don't, that's because that is how most of them were discovered. That will be the answer, not necessarily like how the guy like accidentally tasted it.
Yeah, I wouldn't make it that specific.
Okay, awesome.
So if we were to just put bad laboratory experiences, we would get the answer right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It should be pretty self-explanatory.
What happens if I go so into detail? He licked his fingers, he figured it out, and that's how it became.
I mean, that's a multiple choice question, so if you want to take the time to write all of that,
Never mind.
I'll probably glorify that with a smiley face next to all of your answers, but other than that, you know, you don't get extra credit.
Great job.
Yeah, great job. Everyone feel pretty good about this. I'm sure the quiz that you recently just took didn't make people feel very good, but you know, I think that if you just listen to this recording, you will do just fine. Well, not just listen to this recording, listen to this recording and make sure that you know the study guide. Because those of you that did really well on the first exam, if you turn the study guide into something like flashcards, if you study together and let's say you just like study together and you just bring up one of the topics on the study guide and you can explain it, I would highly recommend doing that rather than just writing out the study guide or reading over the slides over and over again. That's not the most efficient way for certain people to study. I personally, I wish I was one of those people that could just absorb information after hearing it, but I'm not. I really have to interact with information in order to understand it and to be able to regurgitate it on an exam. But ultimately, what I'm trying to do too is not just have you regurgitate information. I'm trying to get you to understand some of these more complex concepts, like the omega-3 coming from plant sources versus animal sources, et cetera. So
I think for the next exam, we should have a potluck resemble that to how it's good and bad for us for the next exam.
Wow, a potluck. That's a good idea. Let me, yeah, for the final, let me see what I can do about that. Because California has some really interesting rules about bringing food and whatnot, right? Because like, what if I don't know that someone has an allergy and then we bring like a food and someone sues?
We could have a ingredient list for if you bring your food, like a food.
Yeah, like warning allergens.
Yeah.
I feel like the only people who are gonna come is the people who are here right now.
That's fair.
Hey, I'm down.
We
I'll
can
whip
just all go to dinner at this point.
Yeah, that's fair. That sounds pretty good. You just order your own stuff. I'm
Question.
waiting for that new sports bar to open up at in that little plaza with the Target and whatnot. That sounds great.
Haven't heard about that.
Yeah, it's like right next to where Michael's and Party City used to be, and
It's in front of the movie theaters.
oh yeah. There you go. I forgot there was a movie theater there.
New
Because
spot.
every time that I want to watch a movie there, it's never like it's always at the most inconvenient time. So we always end up going to Monterey instead.
Question. When you upload this, are you gonna put subtitles?
Nope.
Okay.
Would be
I don't even know
helpful.
how to do that. So
I have the subtitles like here.
No,
shown.
I'm only asking because some professors like block it where you can't even put the subtitles on your own.
oh, I'm not going to block anything. I'm just
Okay.
going to literally take this and then put it up on YouTube. I want to make that as minimal effort for me as possible, but also as helpful as possible.
Do you have a Zoom recording on YouTube from a previous semester going over this same material as well?
I did. I just took it down,
Okay.
and now I don't have the recording anymore.
Oh no.
Oh, it's somewhere in the cloud. It's okay.
It's somewhere in the cloud, yeah. If you look through that YouTube channel, and I implore you not to do that, you'll
I
find
have already.
just like what's that?
That's just gonna make us want to go look through it now.
I did that in the beginning of the semester.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff from when I was like 18 in there, so don't dig too far. There's a lot of World of Warcraft stuff. There's some like
All
videos
that.
of me playing like Super Smash Bros. So yeah, don't dig too deep.
Yeah, I watched them all. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. That sucks.
No, I'm messing around. But I did find your the videos that you posted from previous semesters covering these study guides previously, and I found those really helpful.
Oh, awesome. Well, I wish I had known that y'all were doing that, and I would have kept them up. I was just trying to reduce the overall, like, because I feel like YouTube probably has restrictions on how many videos I can upload. So just trying to clean house. I'm not a YouTuber, so I never plan on being one.
Daily vlogger.
Yeah, that sounds like a miserable existence. Sorry to those. I mean, to me, it sounds like a miserable existence because I don't even like taking pictures for people. You know, like I'll take like a picture to remember something, and then I just want to experience it. So anyway, all right, that's a fun little snippet for everyone else to watch. Any other questions before we end?
When would this video be posted?
I am literally going to convert this to an MP4 right now, and then I'm going to upload it as soon as humanly possible. And then I'll send an email out with the link, probably even before it's done uploading.
Okay.
I think you mentioned that you're going to be going over more material on Monday. Am I right?
Not more material. I'm just going to, I want to have the opportunity to touch on all of the relevant points for the protein chapter.
Okay.
Like being able to see the slides and touch on everything that I know you're going to be tested on, just so that you have that visual connection as well.
Right on. Sounds
using the rest of class to kind of just handle any other questions that weren't answered by this session.
This is on chapters 4, 4.5, and 5, right?
Whatever chapter, I think 4 is carbohydrate, 4.5 is the non-nutritive sweeteners rant, and then is it 7 and 8 or 6 and 7? It's the protein and the fat chapters, whatever chapters those are.
Okay.
So technically it's 4. It's artificial sweeteners, which is its own thing that I made up, the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, which should be more than enough. It's very dense. Any last questions? You good?
Whoever said they were bringing the tissues, can y'all bring some extra ones?
Thanks for bringing the tissues, Ashley. All right, I'll see y'all later.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Professor.
Have a good one.
Absolutely. All right. Happy
Thank
study.
you.
Great weekend.
Have a great weekend.